Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Perugia. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about AI reporting. And thank you so much to JournalismAI for organizing this panel and for their support of this field. Predictive and algorithmic predictive and surveillance technologies, their impact around communities around the world is one of the most important and urgent stories of our time. It's also a story that is not just a technology story, but it's a deeply human story and an equity story as well. If unchecked and unaccountable, algorithms have the potential to harm the most vulnerable members of society, deepening economic and social gaps, and also amplifying racial bias. So how do we hold AI accountable is the question that we are trying to answer in this panel. And what is the role of journalism in that? And more importantly, how to ensure that journalists and that more diverse journalists enter this field and have the confidence and the skills to interrogate these systems. So the goal of this panel is to demystify algorithmic accountability, to show that there are many different approaches and that we don't need to be technology reporters or coders to approach these stories. So we have a stellar panel of journalists who have done this, taking many of those different approaches. They have tested research methods, and they are incredibly generous to share their best tips. So let me introduce them briefly. We have Surya Mattu here, who is a senior data engineer and a data journalist at the Markup. He's also an artist, so he has both sides of the brain, which I don't. Right to his left is Uli Koppen. She leads the AI and Automation Lab at Bavarian Broadcaster in Germany, and co-leads BR Data, the Investigative Data Journalism team. And we have Melissa Heikkila. She's a senior AI reporter for the MIT Technology Review, a position that she will take just in the next few days. But until recently, she has been Politico Europe's AI correspondent and the author of the very popular newsletter AI Decoded. So for the first section of the panel, each of our panelists is going to tackle one aspect of AI accountability that is important in their own work, and they're going to share their lessons, the lessons they learned along the way. And then we will have a little conversation, and we will involve you the last 15 minutes to ask your questions from where you are seated, very short questions that then I can repeat on the microphone, so we can all interact. So with that, I am going to go to Surya, who's going to talk about AI accountability when it comes to platforms, which is an area in which he has done incredible work.
Thank you very much. Hi everyone, my name is Surya Mattu. I'm an investigative data journalist at the Markup, and I'm going to share with you a project that we've been working on at the Markup for the last year and a half called Citizen Browser. It is our attempt at monitoring Facebook's algorithmic recommendations on their platform, and I'm going to just walk through how we did it, what kind of data we collected, what some of the challenges were, and what kind of reporting was enabled thanks to this project. So with that, I'm going to closer to the mic. Okay. Ooh, too close. Is that better?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, can I get my slides? Okay. Let me see if I can just make this full screen. Yeah. Okay. So Citizen Browser is a project, like I said, to measure what we call the public square of Facebook. We were really interested in this project to not see how people use the platform, but rather what does Facebook recommend to people on their platform. So it was really not designed to look at user interaction, just what was coming into their feeds so that we could look at it at scale. So we built essentially a custom web browser. Well, we didn't build a custom web browser. We built a programmatic way to control a web browser so that we could essentially allow people to log into this browser once, into Facebook once, and then this app would run in the background on their computer, and 3 times a day it would just go and collect the news feed, the group recommendations on Facebook, and the pages recommendations page. So we basically had a paid panelist of people who downloaded this app. They were a national panel in the US. We started with about 1,500. By the end, we had around 3,000. And all they had to do was they downloaded this application, they logged into this, to Facebook through it the first time, and then once they were done, it just ran in the background, and it basically 3 times a day would just open up a browser kind of in the background, scroll all the way down, capture all the data as it was coming in, and send it to our servers. There's a lot of questions around privacy, which I'll talk about in a second, but this is kind of the high-level steps that we took. We recruited a panel of people who we paid to participate in this. We've had some people who've been sharing data with us for about 1.5 years now. Others have come and gone. It wasn't a nationally representative panel. There were skews in the demographics, but it was better than anything else that exists, so we kind of tried to account for that. And so far, this is what we managed to do. So 3,500 panelists in the US. We had 600 contributors from Germany. We collaborated with the newsroom there for the German elections. And we've collected 20 million posts, 57 million recommended groups, and 3 million targeted ads. Now that middle one is something that I care about a lot, the 57 million recommended groups, because one of the reasons we built this platform is if you rely on a company's APIs to get data from them, they basically decide what data is available to you to access. So group recommendations or something is not something that you can actually get from Facebook. There's no programmatic way to get it. They don't have a service like this. And we know a lot of research has shown how the way misinformation spreads tends to be through things like Facebook groups. So this was our way of measuring what actually happens on the platform, independent of the data that the platform provides. So the obvious question when you're doing this kind of project is, what about privacy? What about user privacy? So we took extensive steps to think about this. And essentially, if you looked at the data as it came in, this is what we were actually looking at. So we removed all personally identifiable information, all comments, all impressions. We only looked at public posts that could be accessed without having to know the person. We looked at links that were being shared in the posts, and we looked at ads. So everything else on the platform was not accessible to us. So we had a very extensive redaction process where we were constantly keeping track of the data coming in to make sure that, so this was a challenge because Facebook updates their platform very often. So we had to constantly update our parsers and our scrapers to ensure that we were constantly monitoring the quality of data coming in, redacting all the personally identifiable information. So even though it looked like this, because what our hypothesis was to test for Facebook's algorithmic actions, we didn't really care about the user content as much as we cared about the links that were being shared, what the platform was recommending, and for us, this served our purpose. So this is how we built this panel and built the tool. It's been running for 1.5 years, and I just want to quickly walk through some of the examples of stories we've done through this. So the first one we actually did was around Donald Trump and the way Facebook was treating the misinformation he was spreading on the platform. So we actually noticed through this study, through this project, that the way Donald Trump's posts were being treated or flagged as misinformation was different to everyone else's for the same content. So it was actually like there was a different binary, which good or bad is a different question, but we were able to measure that and show that the same links that were shared by people who were not Donald Trump were getting flagged for misinformation or risks, and they weren't when it was coming from Donald Trump. The second was this story where we were actually, Facebook had been saying since December that they were going to stop pushing political group recommendations on their platform. This is September of 2020. So we did this right before, we started this project right before the US elections. So they've been saying this for a while, and we noticed that they constantly were, in fact, still pushing political groups. In fact, even after the January 6th Capitol riots, they said, like, we've totally stopped it, we're not doing it anymore. And we found examples of political groups being shared on the platform through our panel. And it was really interesting. So we did a story about this. We showed this through the data we collected. And then Senator Markey wrote them a letter. And right after he wrote them the letter, the recommendation stopped. And what is even more interesting was that later in the year, the Wall Street Journal published this big expose through the leaks of Frances Hahn, and we saw in the leaks that this story actually got escalated all the way up to Mark Zuckerberg, and it turned out there was a caching problem. The way they were trying to remove the political group recommendations just wasn't actually working, so it was an engineering problem. But without something like Citizen Browser, Facebook would have said, we stopped recommending the groups, and there would have been no way to actually test it. So this is why we believe that independent verification and auditing is important, because otherwise you're just left at the mercy of what a company says they do. We've also been able to make tools like this. This is split screen. This actually gives you a way to see what different demographics Facebook feeds look like and what content they have. Again, all based on real data from the ground in the real world, not hypothetical, synthetic data. And it's kind of what you'd expect, but like I said, it actually is the stuff that's actually happening in the real world. Because I'm going long, I'm going to kind of just skip through these. You can see these on our page, but we've done a bunch of different types of stories around accountability related to the platform. And the last thing I'll say is this one, because this is kind of important, where we were able to use this platform to change the metrics that we use to measure the spread of misinformation. So one of the things the Facebook does is they put out this user content report where they show what kind of content is being most widely seen on Facebook. The way they measure that is they measure reach, where they see how often does one person see a link from a particular company. What we were able to do was measure impressions, which is to see how often are people seeing the same content. Because what we noticed is that misinformation actually is being shown to the same people a lot more often versus if you just measure it once. So using this platform, we were actually able to change the metrics and kind of bring a different kind of accountability to this story. And with that, I will stop because I've gone long. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Surya. So in addition to the platforms, there are many other private AI actors that are designing and deploying algorithms, and holding them accountable and investigating them is the mission of Uli and her team in Germany. So you can take it away.
Thanks, Marina. Sorry? Okay. I'm Uli Koppen. I'm part of German public broadcasting, and there is a southern section called Bavarian broadcasting, and this is where I co-lead 3 teams. It's a data team, an investigative team, and the new AI and automation lab. And we all are using technology somehow for journalism, and I want to start with showing some work that you can understand what we understand by algorithmic accountability reporting. And then I want to dive into some learnings that you can have some really practical takeaways from today. So, as I said, we are using algorithms for journalism, and we are having 2 legs we're standing on. We have one leg that is older, so to say, the investigative part. We built that up with the data team and also with the investigative team, and the lab jumped on that as well and added some new skills. And we also have another mission. It's automated formats. And it's very unusual to combine content and product. When we started off, we asked ourselves if we can do that. Till now, it worked out quite okay. And today, we're going to focus on the left leg, the investigative journalism, so to say. To give you some examples of our work we did during the last years, we did, for example, a story on a vaccination algorithm that seems to disadvantage elderly people. It was very important during the COVID time. We looked at platforms such as Facebook, and in this case, it was called Hate Machine Facebook. We saw how Facebook detained content that was illegal, such as swastikas and right-wing content, and extreme content, so to say, for a very long time on the platform. And we were able to detect that with an object recognition algorithm and other automated methods to detect this kind of content. And well, when we can detect that, Facebook can for sure. And we even used an algorithm that was developed by Facebook Research. So we somehow showed with their own tools what they had on their platform. Together with Der Spiegel, we did a story on a credit scoring algorithm called Schufa. And in Germany, that's a big thing because every German citizen is called by Der Schufa. And we wanted to shed light in this black box algorithm because for this firm, this algorithm is a trade secret, so they don't have to really tell how it's working. And we gathered a lot of data together with 2 NGOs to be able to analyze that and to shed some light on that. And a story we just did recently is tackling the question, is our phone listening to us? And we managed to program an app that captures the mic, and that we showed that it is possible to do that. So this is the kind of reporting we are doing. We are stealing methods from social science and also computational methods and bring that into journalism and try to answer some questions or hypotheses. And this is the kind of reporting we are doing. Today I want to dive a little more into this story we did last year. It's on an AI recruiting software, and this is a phenomenon some of you perhaps know from the US, that a lot of assessment centers there work with videos. So the applicant is sitting in front of their screen, they're answering some questions. They can also talk about what they had for breakfast. And after a few seconds, in this case after at least 30 seconds, this software promises to extract personality traits. And this should offer HR and recruiting companies help and also make the process more effective. This is what the software is promising. So we tried to take a look at the software, we could get a hold of it and scrutinized it. And I want to show you some experiments we did with the software. In this case, we had the help by an actress, and she was reperforming the same speech in the same tone of voice and the same mimics over and over again, and only changed one thing. In this case, she wore glasses, she wore a headscarf, she wore different clothes. And as you can see here, the original video was done without glasses, is the blue line, the yellow line is with glasses, and the output is different, as you can see. As we know, and as you know, for an AI, of course, a video that is done over and over again isn't the same. So we were interested in what if we can hold every variable in a video constant and only change one variable. In this case, we did technical experiments, and this person is standing in front of a white wall, and we exchanged that against a bookshelf. And every other variable of this video was the same. In this case, there was really a large difference in the output. You can see the original blue line, and the bookshelf line is yellow. And we also were interested in, can we manipulate the software in the way like books make me look more open in this case? It's not the case, and was very different for every person we tried it out. So we could tell the story that this software isn't stable, that it's an example for an algorithm that is used in a very sensible field like hiring. And we could also spark the debate, is it possible to use this kind of algorithm now in such a sensible field? Our answer was clearly no. And, well, end of story. Now let me dive into the learnings and some takeaways. What is very important for us, and I'm sure for every reporter covering a story, is that it is relevant for many, many people. In this case, we draw the line from the US to the UK to Europe, where it is just starting off, and where startups start to get some funding for that. So it's relevant for us that we can tell a story about people's lives. And also the angle of the story for us are people and not technology. As Marina said before, it's a deeply human story for us, and we have to keep that in mind when we are telling the story, that it's not about the software, it's about what does the software do with people's lives. This is also why we chose this kind of background in our storytelling. So it's the people in front of a camera. Also, as you can tell, our experiments sometimes get a little off and are kind of difficult. And we want to keep that out of the story. We, of course, want to explain what we did, but we want to put the meaning for people's lives in front. And we found that very useful after a certain amount of stories we did, to do the methodology in a separate story, in a separate page. Of course, we want to be transparent about our methodology. We also publish the data when we can. That is very important. This is what every good data journalist does. But sometimes, or I would say very often, it makes sense to keep that out of the story and just tell small details about the experiment in the story and the methodology extra. When we have in mind to debug a system, in this case a software, we always have in mind that it's society we are debugging, because behind algorithms are people, people are society, and we have to keep that in mind when we are telling a story, that it's not the system we're looking at society, and we want to spark a debate on how we want to use algorithms as a society and how not. And now I'm coming to the question marks in my head, or the, let's say, flaws also in our industry you have to tackle, in our team. There is still a lot of need for accountability stories, and I pasted you here the example of a study that was done by the Bertelsmann Foundation, and they looked at how many accountability stories are out there. And they found that there's a lot of more positive talk on tech, on AI, on new devices, on software, than really accountability reporting. So it is still very important that we dive into that. We have to get more reporters on the beat, more newsrooms to really cover the stories. That's really crucial. On the other hand, we are not very good in covering a story and also show a solution to something, or a constructive part of that. And I would argue in tech reporting that is very, very important because we as a team, we are looking at both sides of the medal somehow. We are having this investigative perspective, but we're also using this technology for journalism and try to make journalism better with that. We have to get somehow this perspective into our reporting, because for our users it's very important to understand algorithms per se are a tool. You can kill with a tool, but you can also do good with a tool, and this kind of debate is not happening enough right now, I guess. And the last point goes to the work also Marina does with the Pulitzer Center. How can we get more inclusive, and how can we open the beat up for more people? And I found it very enlightening when I looked at the new editorial strategy by Vox. They did a refurbish of their editorial strategy, and they had a beat that was very important to them. It's called Identities section. And it's all about what happens in society, issues like gun violence, abortion issues, things like that. And when they did the refurbish, they said, we're gonna destroy this kind of silo. We make out of this vertical a horizontal, so that we can look at it with an intersectional lens. And I would say we can also do that with algorithmic accountability reporting, because as we said, society is behind that, and it's a lot of societal issues we have to tackle with that. And we as a team, we always try to get reporters that are in the field and that are experts on certain issues in the process and have their voice in the team. And with that, we can learn from them. And we can also disseminate what we can as a team within our broadcaster. But we can get much better there, and this would be my sense on the inclusive, my 2 cents on the inclusive question. So thank you, and very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Uli, for the fantastic work that your team does. It's so inspiring. And we're going to go to Melissa now. One of the questions that she's been asking, one of the many questions in her reporting, is around regulation. Are regulators in Europe, in the US, elsewhere, really ahead, or are they playing catch-up? So take it away, Melissa.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Melissa Heikkila, and for the past couple of years, I've been reporting on the weird, very weird world of EU AI policy. Can I get my slides, please? I'm obviously extremely biased. I think AI policy reporting is very interesting, and there's never been this many concrete regulations and policies ever. It's a big trend in AI right now. That's partly due to this. For a long time, AI was this hugely hyped technology, but now it's starting to be applied in everyday applications everywhere. And regulators are finally starting to catch up. They're realizing we need to do something with this technology. And especially in the West, there's a lot of anxiety that if left unreined, authoritarian countries such as China might develop this technology in a way that isn't in line with Western or democratic values. So the EU in particular wants to think of itself as the world's leading tech regulator. So their answer to this problem and how to rein in tech and AI specifically and create a global standard is to create the world's first AI law. It's called the EU's AI Act, and it was unveiled almost exactly a year ago. This is a scoop, or a leak I got of a draft of the bill, and there we saw for the first time like what the EU is thinking. It's a really peculiar law. There isn't anything like it. I'll go into that in a bit. So this is too long didn't read of the EU's AI law. It's basically a product safety framework for high-risk AI uses that are likely to harm people. For example, in the UK, you had a school grade scandal when algorithm ranked kids' grades and ranked kids in private schools with better grades and kids in public schools with lower grades. So this bill is supposed to protect us from scandals like this. And it also bans unacceptable uses of AI, such as social scoring, which is a system popularized in China, which ranks people based on their perceived trustworthiness, as well as the use of facial recognition technology from law enforcement in public places, with some exceptions. And it's now being debated in the European institutions, and some of the big fights that we expect is, how do you legally define artificial intelligence? Like, practitioners don't even know what our AI is. How can an EU politician define it? And also, what kinds of AI applications fall into this high-risk category and into the scope of the bill? And whether to ban facial recognition in public spaces altogether. That is something that the EU is very, very seriously considering and could happen. But don't hold your breath. It won't be happening anytime soon. It'll be at least until 23 that we'll get a final version of the text, and then it'll take a couple of years until it enters into force. So how do you report on a bill like this? Brussels is a really interesting and weird place where there's a lot of information and there are no secrets, but there's not a lot of transparency. So the only way to hold people accountable and get information is to get leaks. And the emojis are not a secret symbol. They're indicating, they're my leak-o-meter, like how different institutions leak. So for example, the European Commission, which is the EU's executive arm and drafts laws. What they like to do is they like to leak a document, a draft like the one I got earlier, and test the waters. What does Google think of this? Is Germany going to be mad? And they can leak and test these policies without being held accountable, right? Because when you ask the European Commission, well, your leak had this, why is it not in the final bill? They'll say, we don't comment on unofficial leaks. We've never seen this. Obviously, they have. But yeah, so the European Commission is semi-leaky. And the European Parliament, so how EU regulation works, once the European Commission drafts a bill and presents their vision, the European Parliament and EU countries gather separately, amend the bill, what's their ideal version of it, and then finally they meet in trilogue negotiations. And then the final bill will be like a mishmash of the three texts. So the European Parliament and the EU countries are currently analyzing the bill and we're starting to see some first concrete amendments and what people are thinking, but it's a very long text, so again, wouldn't hold your breath. But in the European Parliament, they're very leaky. There's lots of political players, lots of spinning, lots of House of Cards action, so that's a great place to get some leaks. In EU countries, they have their negotiations among diplomats in closed-door meetings, and this is really interesting because they're supposed to represent governments, but they don't really like to talk about what they're pushing. You might have your government pushing for something that you didn't necessarily vote for. And it's also really interesting to see how the power dynamics in the EU are playing out. It's really important, because of how the voting works, bigger countries have more votes. So it's really important to see which countries are forming coalitions, who's on the side of France, who's Germany teaming up with. With the AI Act, I suspect it's going to be a real pain because France wants to have more facial recognition amongst its law enforcement, and Germany, the new German government, is actually proposing a full ban. And I don't know how those two sides are going to meet in the middle. They probably aren't. And the Council, or the Council of EU countries, there's always a leak. And there it's really good to see what different countries are pushing. And I've left Politico, but if I were working at Politico, I would be following one country in particular, in addition to France and Germany, which is the Netherlands. Because, I don't know if there are any Dutch people in the room. Okay, great. Well, the Netherlands is one of the EU's most tech-savvy countries. They really know their stuff and are really adopting AI. But they screwed up really badly. And we're going into that now. This is a story I did just before I left. This is devastating. So for around a decade, the Dutch tax authority used a self-learning algorithm to try to spot fraud. So they created an algorithm that created risk profiles on people based on completely whack-like criteria, I have to say. And the idea was that, okay, we'll create these risk profiles and we'll see who's likely to commit childcare benefit fraud. And then the authorities penalized people based on the recommendation of the algorithm without having any proof of fraud. And conveniently, one of the criteria was having dual nationality, big Moroccan and Turkish and Surinamese populations in the Netherlands, and having a low income was another criteria. So this led to, it was devastating. There were hundreds, like tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands families who were affected. It took nearly 10 years of their lives. They were pushed into poverty. I spoke to a woman who had 3 children. She divorced from her partner because she got a tax bill of over 100,000 euros. And that strain, when you're on a low income, she was a social work student. That's really stressful. She had to leave work because of depression and burnout. She separated with her partner. 8 years later, she's still waiting for some sort of justice. Some people, some victims committed suicide. Over 1,000 children were taken into foster care, and all because an algorithm recommended or suggested they committed fraud. That is bizarre. So maybe you remember the Dutch government resigned a couple of years ago and regrouped a year later with basically the same composition. And ironically, the minister who is in charge of the tax office is now in charge of their digital transformation and avoiding similar scandals in the future. So that's great. And the new government has also pledged to create an algorithm regulator that will audit algorithms in both the public and private sector. How they're going to do that, I don't know. So could the AI Act help? You know, the EU has this beautiful new bill that's supposed to protect us from scandals like this. And as the text is, no, it could not. Right now, how it's worded, companies who provide high-risk AI systems would have to meet these EU requirements, but the users would not. And the public sector doesn't have to comply. So, yeah. This is something the European Parliament, I know, are trying to push. I haven't seen what the Dutch are saying in the Council, but anything they say will be very, very interesting. And just last week, the Dutch Parliament just passed a vote calling for mandatory fundamental rights impact assessments in AI systems that make decisions about people, and that's supposed to be some sort of safeguard to prevent these cases, and hopefully they will lobby and get some traction amongst other EU members to have this in the AI Act, but we shall see. And to finish this off, here is my AI policy red flag bingo. Red flag bingo. These are words that I see all the time. They sound really good, but they're very treacherous. So for example, often you see pro-innovation rules. They're not rules at all. It's like the less rules, the better. You also see terms like losing the global AI race or implying that China is doing something and if we don't do it, we'll lose. You know, that's often used to justify things like more public investment in military AI or any kind of AI. Regulation is expensive. That's a spin line we heard during the GDPR, which is the EU's data protection regime. And yeah, turns out it's not that expensive. So yeah, lots of different words that if you spot, I always pay lots of attention to these. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the three of you. I am going to ask a few questions and then we're going to go to your questions, so keep them in mind short. Surya, I'm going to go first to you. A central aspect of accountability reporting, what you do, is documenting harm. So in AI accountability reporting, is it harder to document harm? Is harm more diffuse? And how do we go about it?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. It is hard to document the harm because it is distributed by nature, especially with platforms like Facebook, where always different people are getting different things. So it's hard to make, especially to make a narrative about what the harm is. But I think more than anything else, it comes down to a different way of thinking about it, where what we end up doing is we just have investigations running for a long time. Because it doesn't actually take, to find the systemic harm, you often just need to find a few concrete examples of how it could happen. Because usually what tends to happen is, like, to Melissa's point, the company says something and then it turns out that that wasn't true. So what we end up having to do often is just keep looking for who's actually being harmed and proving that, because till we do that, the company says that's not happening.
And just a quick follow-up on that. I think that there's a little bit of a misconception that for algorithmic accountability to be true accountability, we have to have access to the algorithm, we have to break the black box, and we have to get the data. And that just seems so overwhelming and hard to do that it might prevent some of us from even trying to do this kind of reporting. But what you all have been showing is that you are focusing much more than in the input side of things. You are focusing on the output. You are working with readers, with citizens. You are recruiting them to share their data with you, and you're looking at the impacts. So can we talk about, demystify the reverse engineering of algorithm part of thing?
Sure. I can go first, and I'd like to hear what the other panelists think too. But the way I've thought about it for many years now is it's a form of adversarial research that we do. And this is why, like, I'm not kind of convinced on the we need to show the constructive side. Like, I see the value of the talking point, but from my biased perspective, I feel like our job is to provide precise problems that we see come up in the world, so that we can be clear about what we're saying the harm is. The problem tends to be, in my opinion, when researchers tell me, oh, you're so biased against these tech companies, I say, I'm actually not. I'm kind of following the legacy of security research. So, like, penetration testing, the whole model is to find the holes so that you can plug them. And so it is my goal to explicitly look for the ways things can be harmful to vulnerable people, etc. Because if you don't explicitly look for it, the values of the people who make it are implicitly embedded into those systems.
I think there are different means to really do those investigations. We are having an interdisciplinary team, and it's incredibly great to have that resource, and we are always trying to use computational methods to get insights others can't. I guess that's our mission somehow. But as you could see, there are so many ways to also do the reporting, like Melissa, who is looking for leaks. You said you could also focus on the output. That is absolutely true. You can also tell stories about people, which is also, at least in Germany and in Europe, incredibly hard to do, because sometimes people don't know they are victims of those systems, and then really finding someone who knows that and who is outspoken is not easy, but it's also a reporting task, I would say. And also another tool that is great is FOIA. If you are in a country that has FOIA rights, we are also trying to FOIA information out of the government to be able to give more flesh to the story. So that's also a possibility to really talk about that. And then if a team that is well equipped with technologists like Surya's and ours are doing such an investigation, you can always take the story and find a local version of it. That is also possible. And you are also partnering up with a lot of newsrooms. I guess that is also a possibility to find something there.
Melissa, what would you say? Sorry, Melissa. What would you say are some of the skills that are needed for this bit? How does one prepare to enter this field?
I think you have to be curious and having like a basic understanding of AI terms. You don't have to be an engineer. Well, it helps if you're an engineer, but you don't have to be. I'm not. I have a background in social and political science. And I think that's a really good way of viewing the technology, you know, examining critically the impact it has on our lives. So doing, you know, the University of Helsinki has a really great resource. It's a free online course available for everyone called, in all European languages, it's called Elements of AI. And you can do it, and it's brilliant. It gives you like a baseline, like a basic understanding to help you be AI literate. So you can have conversations with engineers, and you'll know what they mean when they say biased data sets or machine learning. And yeah, and then by having that knowledge, you'll know when things are off. You'll know how to ask critical questions, and you know, if their proposals make any sense.
Let me also hint at the LSE courses on AI, which are free, and you can just look at them. Also great resource.
Uli, and I don't know, maybe Surya wants to weigh in too. You both did this experiment using partnering, let's say, with readers and the community, sometimes actors. What are some of the ethical implications that we should be aware of when we are running these experiments? I'm also wondering how you recruited almost 4,000 people or more than that, and how do you keep track of that? But Uli, do you want to go first?
When we partnered with those two NGOs to crowdsource the data, we had the chance to talk to the NGOs how we want to get that data. Of course, it's not a panel. This is the great difference if you are creating a panel or if you're asking for data and crowdsource it. So you always have to be aware that you are not having a representative set of data. So when you're analyzing that, and also when you're reporting on that, it's so important to tell that to people that we can't tell the whole story. We only have a small pie of the story. And the storytelling around that is also very important. That you can say, for example, for younger men between this and this age, we can say that, and we had this many men in our panel, for example. So to be transparent about what you can say and about what you can't say is very, very important on that.
So I completely agree with that. And in terms of the panel, we partnered with a panel research firm who already had a pool of like an audience of panelists that they could send our study to, which was expensive. So that was that's how we solved the citizen browser problem. We paid a lot of money to the panel company, but the reason we did it that way is because since this was the first sort of experiment of its kind, we wanted to be very, very careful of exactly how we were doing it, and we wanted to make sure we could provide certain guarantees. So we also, along with having a panel research firm, we also had a security company audit our code and our platform to ensure that, so there was no way actually for us to see the raw data. No one on the team could do it. So there's some sort of like kind of checks and balances that we put at the engineering level. But to Uli's point, I think the most important thing is you need a diverse set of people working with the data who look at things from different angles so that you can, again, come down to a very precise definition of what you're saying is harmful. You know, this is something that we kind of come up against again and again, where you get all this data. So there's this arc of hope where you start, you're very hopeful, everything feels really good, and then the data comes and your hope completely drops because you had all these dreams and ambitions of what you would find in it. And it's always disappointing. You never find the silver bullet, and you're always like, was this really worth it? And that's when the work really starts, because that's when you really have to dig through the data and see where you can find the argument. And it's kind of like traditional journalism in that sense of like, trying to stitch together different pieces of information and find connections between them to build a larger narrative. So for me, I think the big thing is the precision. So like Uli said, always publish a methodology and the data for any stories we make, and all the claims are backed and publicly accessible. We get reviews for more complicated stories. We get like essentially peer review research done. We send it to academics. And then also we just talk to experts in the field who tell us what the norms are for these particular subjects, and then how far off the norms what we're finding is.
I would like to talk briefly before we go to the questions from the audience about the global nature of this beat. These are stories that cross borders. These algorithms might be built in Silicon Valley, but they are labeled in the Philippines, they are tested in South Africa, and they are deployed everywhere. So are we seeing that cross-border connection? I have to say, with the Facebook files, for example, I thought, without being too critical, that it was a little bit of a lost opportunity to really bring together a very diverse group of journalists to work together to give that, local knowledge to the research. So where are we on building these cross-border connections for this reporting?
For reporting, yeah, I think we're still very much in our silos, I feel, unfortunately. I mean, let's work together. I would love to do that. I feel like there aren't that, well, speaking from the policy world, there aren't that many people really focusing on it, and especially in the US, I feel, well, there isn't much AI policy in the US, but maybe there should be, so yeah.
As the implications are always important for your audience, it's also very hard that you somehow have to be in your silo to understand what this really means for your country, for your legislation, for the users you're having. But I guess partnering would be the thing to do. But we can use as an excuse that the beat is very, very young. So we just started that. We built up the teams. We built up the pipelines, directions in the direction of universities. So we had to get tech people in our teams. We had to understand how we can work together. Now we're understanding how we can embed those teams into our companies that are somehow legacy sometimes. And all of that is something we already tackled in a very short period of time. So what comes next is opening up. And that is very crucial that we're doing that.
And I just add, I think the work you've done in the past in ICIJ and the Panama Papers and Pandora Papers are a real, kind of inspiring model for how to do this sort of decentralized collaboration across newsrooms, and that's something in the Markup we do think a lot about. So with Citizen Browser, we had the panel running in the US, and we also had a panel running in Germany with Deutsche Zeitung. Sorry, my pronunciation is terrible, I always say it wrong. And essentially, we got a German version of the panel running as well, and we try to build our tools in a way so that we intend to partner with newsrooms across the world, because we do, to your point, we believe that a lot of the technology reporting is a global phenomenon, and we need to find a centralized way, like a networked way of doing that reporting.
Thank you. Do we have questions? Because I have more, but I'm trying to be generous. So do we have hands up for questions? Okay, sir. And please, short.
Question for the panel. Suppose you're writing the AI Act. Who would you hold most accountable? Producers of the AI, building and selling, or the consumers, feeding with crappy input and fail to quality check it out?
So I'm going to repeat it briefly for the ones in the back. So who do you hold accountable with this reporting? The producers, the designers of the technology, or the consumers?
Both. And I think that's also something that the EU institutions are trying to translate into the AI Act. But yeah, both are equal. The balance? Yeah, I guess it's how you use it. Because obviously if you create an algorithm that's meant to spy on minorities, that's bad. But you can also create an algorithm that's supposed to be really good and use it really badly. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think probably, but maybe the users. That's a really tricky question, but probably the users, because you can use a good system in a bad way. Yeah.
Surya?
Difficult question, because we as an industry have a bias versus the tech companies, as you said before. And I guess this other perspective isn't there enough yet, because it's not there in the conscience of the users that they are having a part in this whole equation and in this whole game. So raising this whole debate and this question is our role, and we should do it more, I guess.
So I think of this in two different ways. One way is more than thinking of it in the frame of producers and consumers, I think of it in frames of who has misleading narratives. So if a company is claiming that their software does something that it doesn't, that is something that they should be held accountable for. Similarly, if a person is using software in a way that is not intended to, and it's very clear that it's not intended to be used that way, then they should be held accountable for that. So again, I think the answer is both, but I think the thing that's important there is that in a lot of technical systems, there's this idea that the systems are so complicated that there's no way to know what the harm could be. And the reality is we don't know because people aren't explicitly testing for those things. So you could actually build, it's kind of like, the thing I always find really funny is like when you go to a pharmacy and there's like a generic looking white pill and you put it in your body, you kind of have a guarantee of exactly what that's going to do, and we trust that. So why is this any different? When we go into aluminum cages 20,000 feet above the air, we have guarantees that that will work the way we expect it to. So why is this any different? And the only reason it's different is because these companies have managed to spin a narrative that it's impossible to test these things. And what I hope is that the point of our reporting and this kind of work is to let them know that if they make these kinds of mistakes, that they will be called out for them, because so far that hasn't been happening.
Great. Other questions? Yes.
I was wondering what the panel's experience is with using FOIA to get meaningful information about AI and algorithms, especially in the public sector.
So the question is what experience the panel has with using FOIA, a public records request, for this kind of reporting.
I'll mention one story I worked on a few years ago with Julia Angwin, who I worked for many years and is sort of like one of the leaders in this field. We worked on a story at ProPublica in the US called Machine Bias, where we looked at a criminal risk assessment score that was being used in the prison system. Essentially, it was a score that was being created to figure out whether people should be let out of, who've committed a crime or like appear for trial, whether they should go off on bail or have to go, like kind of what the risk is of them committing a crime again. And that entire data set we got from a FOIA request. It was from the state of Florida, and we got data for 13,000 people. We had to threaten to sue them to get it. But because we had the data, we were able to do that story. So it is possible. It's really hard. We had to look at every state to see where the software was being used and what the laws were. But it is certainly possible.
Very briefly, how do you use AI to investigate AI? And what about all the data brokers that are in between the producers of the technology and the consumers?
I'm happy to take the first question, how do we use AI? I mentioned the story on Facebook we did, and we used an object recognition algorithm that was published by Facebook Research to look for things like pictures like swastikas in a whole data set we gathered. So we wanted to see if there is extremist content in there. As pictures are not tagged, we had to use an algorithm to detect those pictures. And we even used a tool by Facebook itself, which was a nice twist of the story. So we use those tools. For us, it's absolutely not important if that's AI or any other kind of automation, because it's just part of a tool set. And what is even more important to us is that our reporters have a good knowledge of how to investigate AI. For example, the AI recruiting system, there we didn't use any AI to detect any flaws in the algorithm, but to do the experimental setup how to scrutinize an algorithm really demands to understand how this algorithm might work. And this is more the knowledge we have in our reporters' heads than the tools we really use. They are useful, but they are not crucial, I would say, most times.
Okay, I have a question about legal pushback from these companies. We have seen in the US AI companies suing media organizations just last year for $300 million for a single story. So what kind of pushback are you experimenting, and how can Pulitzer Center in this field can anticipate that and protect their stories?
Some experience in this problem. So the way we deal with this is again, transparency in our methods, making everything public. We try to be very precise about exactly what we're finding. We speak to experts. We reach out to the company before we publish anything and seek comment, provide them with all our findings. And most importantly, we are very, very explicit about the limitations of our study. So we're very clear whenever we do an investigation about what we are saying and what we are not able to say and why, because we think that's equally important for these things. So far, we haven't had, knock on wood, we haven't had any serious lawsuits against us, but you know, there's a, I think we were talking about this earlier too, there's like a cost to this, which is like, how spicy do you make your story versus how resilient do you make it to like legal pushback? And we tend to err on the side of medium spicy with the hope that we can, you know, as an Indian, that's a very hard thing for me to accept, but I do. And we go for the medium spicy because what we believe is that if you provide like actual facts that can build towards knowledge, that will over time be more impactful than that kind of zinger headline.
I love the medium spicy. That was perfect. One last question, because we have to start wrapping up. If you had a magic wand, Queen of the World, and you can just touch and one thing that would elevate coverage reporting on AI, what would be that one thing that you would hope to transform, elevate, make possible?
There are so many. I think it's not fair that we are only having one shot. I'm not sure if I want more data analysts in newsrooms or if I want the cultural change in broadcasters, legacy newsrooms more fast. Somehow both.
I can go. For me, like if I had a magic wand, what I would want is essentially something like an accessibility service to let people share their data with whoever they want to share it with. So I think one of the biggest problems we have right now is that we can't actually, like, again, I think I've said this to a lot of people recently, where I feel like a photojournalist in Algorithm City, just trying to take pictures of like the street view of what's actually happening between the algorithms and the people. And the biggest problem is when we talk about algorithms and technology in the research paper kind of construct in abstraction, we lose all the granularity and nuance of what society looks like, what systemic inequality has been forever. And to be able to see how those things interact, you actually have to do it in the real world. So for me, getting data from the people who are actually affected by it is the only way we can get to a better place.
I'd like radical transparency. I'd like information on who the European commissioners are meeting, what did they talk about, what EU countries are pushing for instead of having to search for leaks. Even though it's fun, you know, it'd be great if we could just have an honest conversation about these things. Yeah, so transparency, because there's not a lot of it.
So it looks like the recipe is radical transparency, radical collaboration, and medium spicy. So perfect. We have this recipe for great AI reporting. And with that, we can close. Before we go, I want to tell you that if you're interested in this field, there are organizations and initiatives that have opportunities for you, funding, mentorship, training, including our friends here at JournalismAI. They have a new series of fellowships. I work at the Pulitzer Center. I never introduce myself. I do that in panels often. And we are also launching a new program on AI accountability reporting, so you can talk to all of us after the panel. But thank you so much. I hope you feel more hopeful about this beat, and have a great rest of your day.